Hey everybody, welcome back. We're going to be taking a look at the peripheral nervous system for the remaining part of this section on our nervous physiology. And in this mini lecture, we're going to be looking specifically at the efferent somatic nervous system. This is the system that provides us with voluntary motor control of our skeletal muscles. Let's remind ourselves again about how the peripheral nervous system is divided. It's divided functionally as opposed to anatomically. On one side, we have the motor division of the peripheral nervous system. That's the efferent division. And on the other side, we have the afferent division, which is the sensory. Under the efferent, we have the somatic and the autonomic nervous system branches. The somatic is what we're going to be looking at now. It is going to provide voluntary commands to our skeletal muscles, although we're going to see that involuntary commands can also be sent, and these are going to come in the form of reflexes. The next mini lecture is going to be talking about the autonomic nervous system's motor commands, which are going to be the involuntary commands to cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, and glands. And then we're going to move on to the afferent section in another series of mini lectures.
Before we move on, I want to review some terminology that you'll find associated with the peripheral nervous system. And that terminology is going to be ganglia and nerves. A ganglia, plural, or ganglion, singular, is a cluster of neuronal cell bodies and their associated satellite cells that we find in the peripheral nervous system. Think of it as a cluster of balloons. The nerves are the myelinated neuronal axons that extend from the ganglion, so think of those as being the strings from the balloons. If this sounds familiar, it's because the central nervous system equivalent of a ganglion is a nucleus, and the central nervous system equivalent of a nerve is a tract. So they are basically the same thing, they're just given different names because they are in different parts of our nervous system. I want to remind you that the neuroglia of the peripheral nervous system are the satellite cells and the Schwann cells. The satellite cells are going to function sort of like the astrocytes do in the central nervous system. They help enclose or glue the neuronal cell bodies together to form a ganglion. And the Schwann cells are there to provide two functions. Number one, they produce the myelin sheath, which is wrapped around the peripheral axon. And the second function they also do is they help guide the axon as it grows out from the neuronal cell body. So they help tell the axon where it's going to grow and how long it is going to be. The efferent motor division of our peripheral nervous system is made up of somatic and autonomic branches. So it's made up of a somatic nervous system branch and an autonomic nervous system branch. Whenever I say the word somatic, I want you to think of skeletal muscle. So the somatic portion of our efferent peripheral nervous system is involved in motor control of skeletal muscle, voluntary motor control of skeletal muscle. And the autonomic branch of our efferent peripheral nervous system is often abbreviated as ANS, autonomic nervous system. It is the involuntary motor control over cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, and gland secretion. If you wanted to categorize the central nervous system anatomically, it would be really easy. It's the brain and the spinal cord. Anatomically, the peripheral nervous system is everything other than the brain and the spinal cord. So our peripheral nervous system is going to include things like our cranial nerves, our spinal nerves, and things like our special senses. The cranial nerves, there are 12 pair of them. You learn them in anatomy. There are their names right there as a reminder. For the spinal nerves, there are 31 pairs. So the cranial and spinal nerves, because they're outside of the brain and spinal cord, are considered to be part of the peripheral nervous system. There is, in terms of physiology, a few things I need you to know about the cranial nerves. I need you to know whether or not they are carrying sensory information in to the brain and spinal cord, in which case those cranial nerves are said to be sensory, whether they are carrying motor information out to a particular target. In that case, those nerves are considered to be motor. Or lastly, I need you to know whether they're carrying sensory information in and motor information out, in which case those cranial nerves are considered to be mixed. There is a memory trick you can use. It is a phrase. Some say, my mother bought my brother some bitter beer, my. The S in this sentence stands for sensory, the M stands for motor, and B stands for both or mixed. So that's physiologically the cranial nerves. Physiologically, all of your 31 pairs of spinal nerves are considered to be mixed. In anatomy, you learned that a spinal nerve is made up of two roots, a dorsal root and a ventral root, and they merge together within the vertebral column to form the spinal nerve. You may have also learned that when the spinal nerve emerges from the vertebral column, when it comes out of that intervertebral foramen, it splits into three big trunks. One is called the dorsal ramus, one is called the ventral ramus, and the third is called the rami communicantes. The dorsal ramus is for sensory information in from the skin on our back and any sensory information the back muscles may be sending in. And it will also send motor commands out to our back muscles. The ventral ramus is for sensory information that's coming in from the skin that covers our trunk and our limbs. And again, any motor information that the trunk and limb musculature might be sending in, any sensory information that the trunk and limb musculature might be sending into the central nervous system. So sensory information in from our trunk and our limbs. It also will contain motor neurons that will be sending motor commands out to the musculature of our trunk and those of our arms and legs. What you may not be more familiar with is the rami communicantes. This is a rather complex series of branches that is going to be responsible for sending information to and from the autonomic nervous system. So the rami communicantes deals with our viscera. It deals with motor commands going to cardiac, smooth muscle. It deals with motor commands going to glands, and it brings in sensory information from those structures as well. Because you may not have learned about these dorsal rami in anatomy, let's go over it again. After passing through an intervertebral foramen, a spinal nerve, which I'm going to circle right here, branches into three branches, known as the three rami. Rami is a plural word. The singular word is ramus. So you have a small, thin dorsal ramus, which is going to go off to the back of our body. It is going to supply the skin and musculature of the back, meaning sensory and motor innervation from that area is going to come in and out of the dorsal ramus. Sensory information coming from the skin on our back will go in the dorsal ramus. Motor commands going out to the musculature of our back will pick the dorsal ramus. The ventral ramus is basically everything else for the somatic system, meaning it supplies the skin of the trunk and the limbs. It supplies the musculature of the trunk and the limbs. It is responsible for sensory motor innervation to the ventral and lateral part of our body, so the belly and the sides of our body wall structures, and the muscles of the upper and lower limbs. Anatomically, when you look at the ventral ramus, because it supplies much more than the dorsal ramus, it is significantly bigger. Located just outside the vertebral column are going to be a series of interconnected ganglia, which are referred to as the sympathetic chain or sympathetic ganglion chain. They are part of the autonomic nervous system. We are going to come back to them, so I don't expect you to know everything about them now. But I will say that connecting the spinal nerve to the sympathetic trunk ganglion is done by the rami communicantes, which is the third branch of a spinal nerve. The rami communicantes can be kind of confusing because it's a branch that then splits into two pieces. One piece is called the gray ramus communicantes, which is made up of unmyelinated axons of postganglionic neurons, and the white ramus communicantes, which is the myelinated axons of preganglionic axons. Now, this doesn't make any sense to you now. That's fine. It's okay. We have an entire lecture on the autonomic nervous system, so we're going to come back to these terms of gray and white rami communicantes. Okay, now I'm going to take the anatomy that you know and the physiology that you are learning, and I'm going to combine them together. Anatomically, the spinal nerve with its dorsal ramus, ventral ramus, and rami communicantes contain only axons. The cell bodies are located someplace else. The cell bodies of our somatic motor neurons are found in one of two locations. They're either found in somewhere in the brainstem where those cell bodies will form a specific nucleus, or they are found in the ventral, or what you can call the anterior gray horn, where again, they form a specific nucleus. So here in this picture, we've got right here the anterior gray horn. This little red dot would represent a cell body of a somatic motor neuron. The myelinated axons then come out of the cell body, and they are going to either form part of a cranial nerve, or they're going to emerge from that ventral gray horn, travel through the ventral root of the spinal nerve, and then enter into the spinal nerve. So I'll say that again. The myelinated axons that emerge from the brain stem, they're going to come out and form a cranial nerve. Actually, they're going to form part of a cranial nerve. The myelinated axons that come out of the ventral gray horn are going to form, in part, the ventral root of the spinal nerve, and then they're going to enter into the spinal nerve. Once they are in the spinal nerve, those axons have a choice. They have two choices, actually. If they're going to go to the musculature of the back, they take the small, thin dorsal ramus and they travel to the muscles of the back. If they're going anywhere else, any other skeletal muscle, so if they're going to the skeletal muscles of our trunk and our limbs, they're going to take the bigger, thicker ventral ramus, and they're going to end up at the muscles of the limbs and the body wall. And by that, I mean the muscles of the chest, the abs, and the pelvis. So that's how it works anatomically and physiologically. The rest of this lecture is going to concentrate on the efferent portion of our somatic nervous system. And by that, I mean the motor commands that are going to be traveling to our skeletal muscles. The somatic nervous system is considered to be the voluntary part of the peripheral nervous system. It sends voluntary motor commands to our skeletal muscles, but I will qualify that by saying the muscles of posture and balance are controlled sort of involuntarily by the lower brain centers of our brainstem and cerebellum. There's still motor commands going off to our skeletal muscles, but we are not consciously aware of them. The cell bodies of our somatic neurons are located in the ventral gray horn of the spinal cord, or they're located in a nucleus in the brainstem. The axons that come out of the ventral gray horn will form a spinal nerve. The axons that come out of a nucleus in the brainstem form a cranial nerve. And these axons are myelinated, and they run continuously to a specific skeletal muscle target. Once they get to the target, their synaptic terminals will release acetylcholine, and the acetylcholine will bind to that skeletal muscle and result in its contraction. And I will emphasize this, there's only one neurotransmitter it will release, and that neurotransmitter, acetylcholine, will stimulate the muscle to contract. So if you want to control muscle contraction, you have to control the release of acetylcholine. In the previous slide, I said the somatic motor neuron travels to the muscle, it releases acetylcholine, and as a result, the muscle contracts. That's the only thing that motor neuron can do. Meaning if you want to regulate muscle contraction, you regulate it by not stimulating that motor neuron. There are numerous what I call upper level neurons that communicate with that motor neuron. So the neuronal cell bodies of these motor neurons that are found in the ventral gray horn and the brainstem receive incoming controlling information from many other neurons that I call upper level neurons. And these upper level neurons can either excite the motor neuron and get it to release its acetylcholine, or it can inhibit the motor neuron, and in that case, the somatic motor neuron will not release acetylcholine and you won't get any muscle contraction. Now we're going to learn about the motor neuron, the somatic motor neuron, and we're going to learn about these upper level neurons because collectively they create what is called a somatic motor pathway. In the next few slides, we're going to learn a bunch of motor pathways. And you're going to see that no matter what motor pathway you are learning, they eventually affect the somatic motor neuron that comes out of the ventral gray horn or the brainstem and ends up at a skeletal muscle. Therefore, this somatic motor neuron is considered to be the final common pathway on the way to the skeletal muscle. It is considered the only way any other part of the nervous system can influence the activity of our muscles. Okay, I've said this a few times, but I'm going to say it again. Somatic motor neurons originate in one of two places. They either originate from a brainstem nucleus or they originate from the ventral gray horn. So if you were to find a somatic motor neuron and you traced its cell body back, you would find that cell body would form part of a nucleus, or it would be part of the ventral gray horn in the spinal cord. The somatic motor neurons that extend from the brainstem and spinal cord end up at skeletal muscles, and they are often referred to in physiology as lower motor neurons. They are the last neuron in a motor pathway. Their axons are going to travel as part of cranial and spinal nerves and end up in skeletal muscle. But if you were to ask, say, Google or ChatGPT or whatever artificial intelligence machine you're using, what a lower motor neuron is, it would say the lower motor neuron directly connects the central nervous system, your brain and spinal cord, to your skeletal muscles. In other words, only lower motor neurons provide output from the central nervous system to a skeletal muscle. Damage to lower motor neurons can produce flaccid paralysis on the same side as the damage. You can get a loss of reflex action, you can get a loss of motor tone, and you can get a loss of voluntary contraction.
If you remember, I talked about those quote unquote upper level neurons. Well, there are 4 basic kinds of upper level neurons. There are the local circuit neurons. There are the upper motor neurons. There are the basal ganglia neurons. And then there are cerebellar neurons. These upper level neurons plus the somatic motor neuron, or the lower motor neuron, make up what is called a somatic motor pathway.
Local circuit neurons can be both excitatory and inhibitory to the lower motor neuron. They are physically located close to the cell bodies of our lower motor neurons in the gray matter of the spinal cord. So I'm going to circle, here's one local circuit neuron, here's another one. The black one happens to be inhibitory. The green one right next to it happens to be excitatory. Local circuit neurons are spinal interneurons. They connect sensory neurons to motor neurons. So they connect sensory information to the lower motor neuron. They receive, for example, input from sensory neurons and form part of a reflex arc. However, not every local circuit neuron is involved in a reflex. There are some local circuit neurons that can receive input from higher centers in the brain and then relay that information to the lower motor neuron. So lower motor neurons are small neurons located in the gray matter of our spinal cord that can connect sensory information or sensory neurons to a lower motor neuron, forming part of a reflex arc, or they can connect motor information coming from higher centers of the brain to the lower motor neuron. One major function that local circuit neurons have is that they help coordinate rhythmic activity of multiple muscles. So they help coordinate the rhythmic activity that we find in muscle groups. Great example of that is local circuit neurons are involved in controlling the rhythm of walking. Upper motor neurons are motor neurons that provide excitatory or inhibitory input to our lower motor neurons. They can do this directly by directly synapsing with a lower motor neuron, or they can do it indirectly by synapsing with a local circuit neuron, which then synapses with the lower motor neuron. Upper motor neurons are essential for planning, initiating, and directing sequences of voluntary motor commands to our skeletal muscles. They will extend from the brain to the lower motor neurons, and they form 2 types of somatic motor pathways. One type is called the pyramidal pathway. The second type is the extrapyramidal pathway. And we're going to take a look at both of those right now.
So our somatic motor neurons are going to synapse either with what I call reflex interneurons. These are going to be small neurons that are found in the spinal cord. Or they will synapse with upper level neurons that are going to come from motor areas of the brain. Now these neurons, these upper level neurons, are going to descend into the brainstem and synapse with the somatic motor neurons, which are going to form the cranial nerves. Or these upper level neurons can go straight through, they can keep going right through the brainstem, and they can descend down the spinal cord to form the white matter tracts of the spinal cord, and then synapse with the somatic motor neurons in the ventral gray horn, and then those somatic motor neurons form the spinal nerves and then branch to form our peripheral nerves. Again, it's these upper level neurons and reflex interneurons that are going to be that level of control, because a somatic motor neuron can only do one thing. It can release acetylcholine if you stimulate it, and if you don't want that acetylcholine to be released, you don't stimulate that somatic motor neuron. So that's why these upper level neurons and these reflex interneurons are really important, because that's where the level of control comes from.
The pyramidal motor pathways are named pyramidal because the axons of the upper motor neurons form visible bulges in the medulla oblongata. And these visible bulges that you can see, you may have learned in anatomy, were called pyramids. The pathway of the pyramidal motor pathways are basically made up of upper motor neurons connecting to lower motor neurons, or upper motor neurons connecting to local circuit neurons in the spinal cord, and then those connect to lower motor neurons. Pyramidal motor pathways provide nerve impulses for voluntary movement, for precise, skilled movements. So precise, skilled muscle contractions are the job of our pyramidal motor pathways. There are 3 pyramidal motor pathways. They are known as the lateral corticospinal, the anterior corticospinal, and the corticobulbar. If you see the word cortico, or if you see the prefix cortico, that means this neuron originates in the motor cortex. The end of the word spinal means the pathway emerges from the spinal cord. And if you see bulbar, the pathway emerges from the brain stem. So corticospinal is cortex to spinal cord. Corticobulbar is cortex to brain stem. The pyramidal motor pathways originate in the motor cortex. This means that the pyramidal upper motor neurons, their cell bodies, are found in the motor cortex of our cerebrum. And the axons are then going to leave that motor cortex. They're going to travel through the brain and either end up in the brain stem, or they're going to travel through the brain, keep going through that brain stem, keep going through the spinal cord, and they're going to terminate at some level of the spinal cord in the ventral gray horn. Let's start with the upper motor neurons that start in the motor cortex and end in the brainstem. These upper motor neurons form part of the corticobulbar tract. The upper motor neurons are going to synapse with the lower motor neurons found in a specific nucleus of the brainstem. And then the lower motor neuron axons are going to emerge from the brainstem as a cranial nerve. The upper motor neurons that go through the brainstem and end up at some level of the spinal cord are going to make up the lateral or anterior corticospinal tracts. These upper motor neurons are going to stop in the ventral gray horn at some level where they're going to synapse with the lower motor neurons. And the axons from these lower motor neurons are going to form the spinal nerves. Let's take a look at the corticospinal tracts. There are 2 corticospinal tracts. One is called the lateral corticospinal tract, which runs down the lateral white column of our spinal cord. And then we have anterior corticospinal tracts, which run down the anterior white column of our spinal cord. These 2 pyramidal pathways are the major motor tracts for voluntary skeletal muscle movements that underline fine motor skills. The upper motor neurons are going to originate from the motor cortex. They're going to travel through the brainstem. And as they pass through the medulla oblongata, those axons will form physical bulges that are called pyramids. If you looked inside those pyramids, you would find that many of the axons from these upper motor neurons are going to cross over to the other side of the brainstem. And in anatomy and physiology, the crossing over of axons is called decussation. So if you looked into the pyramids, you would find that the upper motor neurons, most of the upper motor neurons traveling through the pyramids, are going to decussate to the other side. In the lateral corticospinal tract, most axons are going to decussate to the other side in the pyramids. However, there are going to be a few axons that are going to continue through the pyramid on the same side. The anterior corticospinal tract is going to come through the pyramid and it's not going to decussate. If it enters into the left pyramid, it's going to go down the left-hand side of the spinal cord, but it will eventually decussate where it ends in the spinal cord. The connection between the upper motor neuron and the lower motor neuron is going to happen in the ventral gray horn of our spinal cord. It could be a direct connection from upper motor neuron to lower motor neuron, or it could be an indirect connection from upper motor neuron to local circuit neuron to lower motor neuron. As a matter of fact, most of the lateral corticospinal upper motor neurons indirectly connect to their lower motor neuron partners using a local circuit. Let's move on to the corticobulbar tract. The upper motor neurons that form part of this tract originate in the motor cortex, and they stop in the brainstem where they're going to synapse with their lower motor neuron partners. The axons of these upper motor neurons are going to form part of an anatomical structure we call the cerebral peduncles. And these cerebral peduncles specifically are going to be found in the midbrain. The axons of the lower motor neurons are then going to form the cranial nerves 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 9, 10, 11, and 12. The synapsing between the upper motor neuron and the lower motor neurons in the corticobulbar tracts take place in the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata. Synapsing in the midbrain, the lower motor neuron axons form cranial nerves 3 and 4. If the synapsing happens in the pons, the lower motor neurons form cranial nerves 5, 6, and 7. And when the synapsing happens in the medulla oblongata, the lower motor neurons are going to form cranial nerves 9, 10, 11, and 12. If you were taking physiology on campus with me, I would be up at the whiteboard drawing the corticospinal and corticobulbar pathways as simply as I could. And that's what this slide is. It's a virtual whiteboard that shows you both of these pathways. You can see that the upper motor neurons in both of these pathways originate in the motor cortex. The upper motor neurons are shown here on the left-hand side as these neurons in orange. And you can see that they synapse with lower motor neurons, which are shown on the right-hand side, drawn in green. You can see that the lower motor neurons end up at the skeletal muscles. The difference between these two pathways is where the upper motor neuron and lower motor neurons synapse with one another. In the corticospinal pathways, they synapse somewhere in the spinal cord at some level in the anterior gray horn. The corticobulbar pathways are actually three pathways. They can either synapse in the midbrain, pons, or medulla oblongata. If they synapse in the midbrain, the lower motor neurons form cranial nerves 3 and 4. If they synapse in the pons, the lower motor neurons form cranial nerves 5, 6, and 7. If they synapse in the medulla oblongata, they form the cranial nerves 9, 10, 11, and 12. And just in case I haven't said it yet, in the corticospinal pathway, the lower motor neurons, those axons, form our spinal nerves. Let's move on to the extrapyramidal pathways, which are often called indirect motor pathways. These motor pathways will carry nerve impulses that follow complicated circuits. And these complicated circuits can involve the motor cortex, the basal ganglia, the thalamus, and the brainstem. The reason why they're called extrapyramidal pathways is that the axons descending through the central nervous system pass outside of the pyramids of the medulla oblongata. And the indirect motor pathways, or extrapyramidal pathways, are involved in voluntary motor commands, but they're also involved in involuntary and unconscious motor commands. We're going to take a look at three of them. They're called the rubrospinal pathway, which is involved in walking, the reticulospinal pathway, which is also involved in walking, but will be involved in the unconscious motor commands that help underlie our posture, and the vestibulospinal pathways, which are going to be involved in posture and balance. On the right-hand side of the slide, I included an anatomical drawing of the rubrospinal tract, which was diagrammed out by the anatomist Frank Netter. And you're probably going, oh my God, what am I getting myself involved in? Don't worry, I'm going to distill these extrapyramidal pathways down to their basic components. At its basic level, our extrapyramidal pathways are comprised of three motor neurons. We have our lower motor neuron drawn here in green on the right-hand side that is going to come from the central nervous system. It's going to emerge from the anterior gray horn of the spinal cord, travel as a spinal nerve, and end up at our skeletal muscle. Then we've got the upper motor neuron shown here in the middle, diagrammed in orange. This is going to run through the brainstem, and it's going to run down the spinal cord to synapse with the lower motor neuron in the anterior gray horn. And then you're going to have something which does not really exist, but I call it the upper motor neuron. Okay, it's not a thing. You can Google upper motor neuron. You're not going to find anything. But this is my term. The upper motor neuron originates in the motor cortex, and it runs into the brainstem where it will stop, and it will synapse at a particular area in the brainstem with the upper motor neuron. So it's a 3-neuron pathway, an upper motor neuron shown here in black, an upper motor neuron shown in orange, and a lower motor neuron shown over here on the right in green.
The rubrospinal pathway is going to be for commands to the skeletal muscles for walking, and it's going to involve the spinal nerves. We have our upper motor neuron in black, which is going to travel from the motor cortex into the midbrain. It's going to synapse with our upper motor neuron. The upper motor neuron forms the red nucleus of the midbrain. That upper motor neuron is going to travel down the spinal cord to the anterior gray horn at a particular level, either at the level of the arms or the legs. It's going to synapse with our lower motor neuron, and our lower motor neuron is going to travel out to our muscles of walking. So it's basically going to control the arms and the legs. This pathway, I think, is going to be modified by the basal ganglia. So stay tuned. We're going to see that in a second. Our reticulospinal pathway is going to be for posture and walking. It's going to be the same construction, except you'll notice that our upper motor neuron runs a little further into the brainstem. It runs into the pons. And it is going to synapse with upper motor neurons that are part of the reticular formation. Again, this is a network of neurons, both sensory and motor neurons, that kind of course through the brainstem. We learned the sensory portion in the brain when we talked about the reticular activating system. This is the motor portion of it, which is the reticulospinal pathway.
The last extrapyramidal motor pathway is going to be the vestibulospinal pathway. It's a fairly complex pathway that does a lot of things. For example, it will send motor commands out to muscles that are responsible for posture and balance. It sends motor commands out to muscles that are responsible for head and neck position. And in some textbooks, you'll even see the motor commands that control eye movement will be lumped in together with this pathway. The major pathway of the vestibulospinal tract is the one that I diagram here in the top. It's called path 1. Sensory information is going to come in from the ear or from the cerebellum, and that sensory information is going to connect up with an upper motor neuron that starts in the medulla oblongata. Specifically, this upper motor neuron originates in the vestibular nuclei of the medulla oblongata. This upper motor neuron is diagrammed here in orange. It's a very long upper motor neuron because it's going to travel through the spinal cord. It's going to travel through the spinal cord and end up synapsing with a lower motor neuron somewhere along the spinal cord in the anterior gray horn. The lower motor neurons axons are then going to come out of the spinal cord and form the spinal nerves, and these spinal nerves are going to end up in muscles for posture and balance. They're going to end up at muscles that control head and neck position. That's the major pathway of the vestibulospinal pathway. But I'm also going to toss in what is called path number 2. This pathway is often called the vestibulo-ocular pathway. So it's called the vestibulo-ocular pathway. It is responsible for eye muscle movement. And again, it's sort of like the path number 1 in that you have sensory information coming in from the ear or cerebellum. It's going to synapse with an upper motor neuron that starts in the medulla oblongata. This upper motor neuron is pretty short because it's going to synapse with lower motor neurons in the brainstem. Specifically, it'll synapse with lower motor neurons in the midbrain or the pons. And those axons are going to form cranial nerves 3, 4, and 6. Those axons, those cranial nerves, are going to target our eye muscles. And the movement of our eyes is going to be directly related to posture and balance. So that's why often the vestibulo-ocular pathway is taught together with the vestibulospinal. This is why I've lumped them together in the same slide. The final level of control over lower motor neurons that I want to tell you about is the one that the basal ganglia provides. Input from the basal ganglia will assist skeletal muscle movement by providing input to the upper motor neurons of the pyramidal and extrapyramidal pathways. The basal ganglia to pyramidal connection is considered to be a direct motor pathway, and the basal ganglia to extrapyramidal connection is an indirect pathway. So I've diagrammed over here what happens. It starts off with the thalamus. The thalamus is constantly sending excitatory impulses to our motor cortex to promote body movement via the upper motor neuron, lower motor neuron connection. These excitatory impulses have to be inhibited by the basal ganglia if we want to prevent unwanted movement. Specifically, there is an area of the globus pallidus that will negatively influence the thalamus. So it shuts off these excitatory impulses to the motor cortex. And as I said, we eliminate any unwanted movement. However, when we do actually want to move, we've got to get rid of this negative influence. And this is where the other parts of the basal ganglia come into play. The caudate nucleus and putamen will then negatively inhibit the globus pallidus. So they shut off the globus pallidus, and in doing so, they shut off the negative influence the globus pallidus has on the motor cortex. That is going to free up our thalamus, again, to relay excitatory commands to the motor cortex. The motor cortex then turns on and sends a motor command down the upper motor neuron, lower motor neuron pathway. So think of it this way. The thalamus provides a quote-unquote go signal to the motor cortex, and the motor cortex sends its command to the body. That's great when we want to move, but the problem is if we don't want to move, this constant go signal can create unwanted skeletal muscle movements like muscle tics and jerks. To prevent that, we have a globus pallidus, which shuts down the thalamus to eliminate any unwanted movement. Now, when we do want to move, the caudate nucleus and putamen have to shut the globus pallidus down. So they inhibit the globus pallidus, and this is going to okay the motor cortex to send its motor commands to the body. The substantia nigra, which is part of our brainstem, it's part of our midbrain, produces a neurotransmitter called dopamine. And dopamine is known to affect muscle tone by modifying the activity of the caudate nucleus and putamen. It actually boosts the ability of the caudate nucleus and putamen to okay the motor cortex and the motor command coming out of it. And the last thing I'll say about the caudate nucleus and putamen is that it receives sensory input from several areas of the brain, so it kind of knows what the muscles are doing. Our cerebellum's input on motor commands involves 4 things. In other words, the cerebellum's function involves 4 activities. It has the ability to monitor our intention for movement. It has the ability to monitor actually how we are moving. And then it can compare those 2 things. It can compare the intention with what we're doing because the cerebellum receives sensory information from things like our eyes and our inner ear. And once it compares the command with that sensory information, it can correct. And it can do so by sending corrective information to certain upper motor neurons. For example, the cerebellum can send information via the thalamus to the upper motor neurons that originate in the motor cortex. And it can correct the motor commands that will travel down the corticospinal and cortical bulbar pathways. Or it can send corrective information directly to the lower motor neurons that emerge from the midbrain of our brainstem. And this corrective information affects the rubrospinal pathway. And if you remember a few slides ago, we said the rubrospinal pathway is involved in walking. There is a medical application that deals with upper and lower motor neurons, and it is a disease known as amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, which is also called Lou Gehrig's disease, named after the baseball player who announced he was retiring from baseball decades ago because he suffered from this disease. ALS is characterized by significant muscle weakness and atrophy. It results in the destruction of motor pathways over time. And as a result of these motor pathways, it is fatal. It begins in regions of the spinal cord that affect hands and arms and then spreads throughout the body until skeletal muscles such as the diaphragm are affected. It is the specific destruction of the axons of upper motor neurons, of the corticospinal and rubrospinal tracts, plus the destruction of cell bodies of the lower motor neurons found in those pathways as well. It's an unknown cause, although about 15% of cases are thought to be inherited. This is called familial ALS. And there are numerous reasons why this disease might manifest itself, but it may be in part due to increased levels of the neurotransmitter glutamate. Glutamate, by and large, is a very powerful excitatory neurotransmitter. Glutamate might actually be released in very high levels by neurons because the gene controlling the recycling of this neurotransmitter is mutated. So excess glutamate in synaptic clefts can result in motor neuron malfunction and death. This is one of the reasons why this disease may develop. Other causes may include protein misfolding, oxidative stress, mitochondrial misfunction, things like that. There is a drug called riluzole, which may help reduce the damage to motor neurons by decreasing glutamate concentration and the resulting overstimulation of motor neurons. However, this drug is modest in its effectiveness, and if it does work, it only lessens the symptoms for a few months. Lower motor neurons communicate with muscle cells through a special kind of synaptic connection known as a neuromuscular junction. So the neuromuscular junction is where the end of the lower motor neuron communicates with a muscle fiber, or what we call a muscle cell. I'm going to remind you that the end of the neuron are structures known as synaptic end bulbs. So really what the neuromuscular junction is shown here over on the right-hand side of this slide. The synaptic end bulb containing neurotransmitters communicating across a cleft with the membrane of the muscle cell. An action potential is going to arise in this lower motor neuron. It's going to travel down the axon, and then it's going to enter into all of those synaptic end bulbs and lead to the release of the neurotransmitter. And the nice thing about a neuromuscular junction is there's only one neurotransmitter. It's acetylcholine. And when it binds the muscle fiber, it leads to muscle contraction. So a neuromuscular junction is always excitatory. This means the only way inhibition can take place is by the upper motor neurons inhibiting the activity of the lower motor neuron. There are several compounds that are related to the neuromuscular junction and its release of acetylcholine. And I want to give you three really interesting ones. One is the toxin that is released by the black widow spider. This causes an explosive release of acetylcholine from the neuromuscular junction. However, it can also cause the release of acetylcholine by other neurons outside of the neuromuscular junction. So in other words, if you are a neuron that produces and releases acetylcholine, the black widow toxin will cause you to release it in large amounts. The reason why this is important is that a prolonged and explosive release of acetylcholine at the neuromuscular junction will lead to a prolonged depolarization and contraction of the muscular target at that junction. And if this is a prolonged contraction of the diaphragm, it essentially paralyzes the diaphragm and can lead to respiratory failure. To be quite honest with you, though, it is very rare for someone to die of a black widow bite unless they're an extremely young child or an elderly person. Another compound is a toxin called botulism toxin, which is released from a bacteria called Clostridium botulinum. This botulism toxin blocks the release of acetylcholine from the neuron at the neuromuscular junction. So you don't get a release of acetylcholine, and the downstream muscle target is basically paralyzed and doesn't contract. This again can cause death due to respiratory failure. And then finally, there is what's called blow dart poison, or curare. This is an acetylcholine antagonist, meaning that it binds the acetylcholine receptor and blocks its activity. Luckily, curare reversibly binds these receptors, but it does bind for quite a good amount of time. The problem is, with a receptor antagonist like curare, you bind the receptor and the receptor is blocked and doesn't do anything. So this binding doesn't trigger the opening of the sodium channels in the muscle cell. It doesn't cause depolarization. It doesn't cause an action potential, and it doesn't cause muscle contraction. And again, death is due to respiratory failure. Let's spend a little bit of time taking a look at reflexes. Neural wiring of a reflex requires 5 functional components. You need a sensory receptor. You need a sensory neuron. You need an integrating center, which can either be found in the brainstem or the spinal cord. And you need a motor neuron, which leads to an effector. There are several ways that you can classify a reflex. You can classify them by development. If you do it that way, two kinds of reflexes, innate or acquired. Innate means you were born with them. Acquired means you learn them. You can classify reflexes based on where you process the information. In other words, where is that integrating center? In that case, there are spinal reflexes and cranial reflexes. You can classify it based on the motor response. Is the motor command sent out through somatic motor neurons, or are they sent out through autonomic nervous system neurons and they control viscera? So we have somatic and visceral reflexes. And then finally, you can classify reflexes based on the complexity of the neural circuit. Is it a monosynaptic reflex or a polysynaptic reflex? Monosynaptic means there's only one synapse involved in this reflex pathway. Polysynaptic means there's more than one. Take a look at a spinal reflex, which is monosynaptic. In a monosynaptic reflex, only one synapse is found in the central nervous system. This is found between the sensory and the motor neuron. So in a monosynaptic spinal reflex, you're only going to have one synapse found between the incoming sensory neuron and the outgoing motor neuron in the spinal cord. I'm going to circle it for you right there. See that direct connection happening in the gray matter of the spinal cord between the incoming sensory neuron in red and the outgoing motor neuron in black. Monosynaptic spinal reflexes are ipsilateral reflexes. In other words, the sensory input and motor output occur on the same side of the spinal cord. And a great example of a monosynaptic reflex is a stretch reflex. A stretch reflex causes contraction in response to muscle stretch. And stretch reflexes exist because they regulate skeletal muscle length and tone. The sensory receptors involved in a monosynaptic spinal reflex, such as a stretch reflex, they're called muscle spindles. They will be activated when that muscle is stretched, and that sensory information is going to come in and then go back out as a motor command, leading to muscle contraction. We're actually going to come back to this. We're going to talk about proprioception and muscle spindles in a couple lectures from now. Perhaps the most well-known and well-described stretch reflex is that of the patellar stretch reflex. This reflex is created when the patellar tendon is stretched, perhaps by hitting it with a reflex mallet. The stretching of the patellar tendon is going to stretch muscle spindles located within the rectus femoris muscle. And this sensory input is going to go directly out as a motor command to the rectus femoris, causing it to contract, and the knee will extend. This is a monosynaptic reflex because it is a direct connection between the incoming sensory neuron and the outgoing motor neuron. But in order for that to happen, you actually have to inhibit the contraction of the hamstring. You can't contract your rectus femoris and get knee extension unless your hamstrings are inhibited. And that reflex goes right along with the patellar stretch reflex. That hamstring stretch reflex is an inhibitory reflex, and it is polysynaptic. And you can tell it's polysynaptic because right here as I'm circling, you can see this purple interneuron connecting the incoming sensory to the outgoing motor. And this outgoing motor neuron is shown in the dotted red line at the bottom. If you'd like to see the patellar stretch reflex in action, you can check out this YouTube video. It is a short little 1-minute YouTube video showing how this reflex is done clinically. Let's take a look at spinal reflexes, which are also polysynaptic. Polysynaptic means many synapses. So a polysynaptic reflex is more than one synapse is involved. A polysynaptic spinal reflex means there's more than one synapse in the spinal cord. The incoming sensory neuron in a polysynaptic reflex is connected to the outgoing motor neuron through something called an interneuron. And in a polysynaptic spinal reflex, that interneuron is located in the gray matter of the spinal cord. I will note that sometimes this interneuron is called an association neuron, and sometimes this interneuron is a local circuit neuron. So they have a lot of terms. But what an interneuron does in a polysynaptic spinal reflex is it connects the incoming sensory neuron with the outgoing motor neuron. We just saw an example of a polysynaptic spinal reflex when we looked at the stretch reflex slide just a second ago. The stretch reflex that caused extension of our knee, that was a monosynaptic spinal reflex. But in order for that knee to extend, the hamstrings had to be inhibited. And that hamstring stretch reflex that inhibits hamstring contraction involves 3 neurons: sensory neuron, interneuron, motor neuron. So it actually has 2 synapses, and it's polysynaptic. Another great example of a polysynaptic spinal reflex is something called a tendon reflex. Tendon reflexes are there to control muscle tension by causing muscle relaxation before contraction rips a muscle off a tendon. Take a look at this short little video, which also demonstrates a tendon reflex. This YouTube video will go over both the stretch and tendon reflexes that you've just learned. Hopefully you looked at that quick little video on a tendon reflex that I gave in the previous slide. So let's talk about it. In a tendon reflex, sensory receptors are going to detect the stretch of a tendon. There's going to be specialized sensory receptors that are referred to as tendon organs. They are involved, again, in a process we call proprioception. We're going to come back to tendon organs, and we're going to talk about them in a subsequent lecture when we talk about muscle spindles. In the standard typical tendon reflex, you can see a possibility of 2 interneurons. You're going to have an inhibitory interneuron, which is going to synapse with motor neurons and causes inhibition and relaxation of one set of muscles. And then there's going to be a stimulatory interneuron, which is going to synapse with motor neurons that causes contraction of a second set of muscles. I included this figure to show you just how complex reflexes can be, particularly those reflexes that are responsible for posture. This reflex is called the withdrawal crossed extensor reflex, and it happens when, for example, you step on a sharp tack and you pull your foot away. That's only one part of the reflex, the pulling of your foot away. On the opposite leg, a whole series of postural compensation has to take place so that you don't fall over. So you can see from this diagram that there are numerous reflex arcs that are set up between these 2 legs, one being pulled away and the one you're left standing on. And each of these reflexes contain more than one synapse, so they are known as polysynaptic reflexes.
For the last few slides, let's take a look at some other reflexes that you may not realize are reflexes at all. There's a scratch reflex. The scratch reflex is transmitted by very sensitive nerve endings near the surface of the skin. This is an inherited innate reflex by mammals. It's there to help us protect and rid our body of parasites and other irritants. Nerve signals pinpoint the location of the itch, and then we scratch with our nails basically to dig at whatever is burrowing into our skin. The effect of the reflex via the scratching movement is usually going to relieve the itch. Keep in mind that you can keep scratching to cause pain, and once the scratching causes pain, that again is another set of signals that is there to suppress the reflex so that we stop scratching the itch. The oculocardiac reflex, or Aschner reflex, is a decrease in pulse rate associated with traction applied to the extraocular muscles or compression of the eyeball. This is especially sensitive in newborn infants and children, although I don't know why you would want to press on an infant's eyeball. But basically, it is mediated by nerve connections between the trigeminal nerve, specifically the ophthalmic portion of this nerve, and the visceral motor nerves that make up the vagus nerve. Motor commands are sent via the cardiovascular center to the vagus nerve to decrease the output of the sinoatrial node, and heart rate slows down. So in essence, you push on someone's eyeball gently, and that information comes in the trigeminal. It gets processed by the cardiovascular control center, and the cardiovascular control center sends a motor command out the vagus nerve to slow down the heart rate. Did you know that a sneeze is a very complicated thing involving many areas of the brain? It's triggered by stimulation of the membranes of the nose, and it results in a coordinated and forceful expulsion of air through the mouth and/or nose. And it's a polysynaptic reflex. The question is, why do some people sneeze when they look at the sun? Yes, this is a thing. It's called the photic sneeze reflex, and it's a condition by which people sneeze with sudden exposure to bright light, like the sun. It's also referred to as sun sneezing. And its official name is, ready for this, autosomal dominant compelling helio-ophthalmic outburst syndrome, or sun sneezing. Autosomal dominant means it's inherited. It is an innate reflex, and it is caused by the dominant allele of a gene. It's actually seen in 20 to 25% of the population. Now, some people may not be very sensitive. Some people have told me that they have this, but they will sneeze only if they feel like they have to sneeze and they look at a bright light. So if they feel like they have to sneeze and they don't sneeze, all they have to do is look at a lamp or look at the sun, and that will trigger the sneeze. The probable cause is a malfunction in nerve signals, again involving our trigeminal nerve. There's some kind of association between this nerve and the optic nerve, because the pupillary light reflex may trigger the trigeminal nerve motor output and the sneeze. So that the wires basically are crossed between the sensory neurons coming in via the optic nerve and the outgoing motor nerves that travel through the trigeminal nerve. The last reflex is called the Moro reflex, which is a startle reflex. It's normally lost by 6 months after birth, so it's innate, but then it's lost. And it's a response to an unexpected loud noise, or maybe when the infant feels like it's falling. It's believed to be the only unlearned fear in humans. We basically learn to be afraid of things, except for this. The origin of this reflex is probably found in the fact that primate infants of our ancestors clung to their mother's fur soon after birth. So if these primates felt like they were falling from their mother, they did the following things, which now in humans is called the Moro reflex. If you startle the baby, they will abduct their arms and spread out their arms. They will unspread their fingers and they will cry, usually. Now, I don't know why anybody would want to test this in a child by going up to an infant and going, boo! But the idea is you scare the heck out of the baby and arms will reach out to grab something and it will unspread its fingers and try and grab. This reflex is tested in evaluating the integration of the central nervous system, since this reflex involves 4 distinct components. All right, guys, that's our somatic motor system. We're now going to look at the partner to this system. That's the autonomic nervous system, and that's in our next mini lecture.